Praise be the nurses and doctors, every medical staff bent over flesh to offer care, for lives saved and lives lost, for showing up either way. Praise for the farmers tilling soil, planting seeds so food can grow, an act of hope if ever there was. Praise be the janitors and garbage collectors, the grocery store clerks and the truck drivers barreling through long, quiet nights. Give thanks for bus drivers, delivery persons, postal workers, and all those keeping an eye on water, gas, and electricity. Blessings on our leaders making hard choices for the common good, offering words of assurance. Celebrate the scientists working a way to understand the thing that plagues us, to find an antidote, and all the medicine makers. Praise be the journalists keeping us informed. Praise be the teachers finding new ways to educate children from afar, and blessings on parents holding it together for them. Blessed are the elderly and those with weakened immune systems, all those who worry for their health. Praise for those who stay at home to protect them. Blessed are the domestic violence victims on lockdown with abusers, the homeless and refugees. Praise for the artists and poets, the singers and storytellers, all those who nourish with words and sound and color. Blessed are the ministers and therapists of every kind, bringing words of comfort. Blessed are the ones whose jobs are lost, who have no savings, who feel fear of the unknown gnawing. Blessed are those in grief, especially who mourn alone. Blessed are those who have passed into the great night. Praise for police and firefighters, paramedics, and all who work to keep us safe. Praise for all the workers and caregivers of every kind. Praise for the sound of notifications, messages from friends reaching across the distance. Give thanks for laughter and kindness. Praise be our four-footed companions with no forethought or anxiety, responding only in love. Praise for the seas and rivers, forests and stones who teach us to endure. Give thanks for your ancestors, for the wars and plagues they endured and survived. Their resilience is in your bones, your blood. Blessed is the water that flows over our hands and the soap that helps keep them clean each time a baptism. Praise every moment of stillness and silence so new voices can be heard. Praise the chants and slowness. Praise be the birds who continue to sing the sky awake each day. Praise for the primrose poking yellow petals from dark earth. Blessed is the air clearing overhead so one day we can breathe deeply again. And when this has passed, may we say that love spread more quickly than any virus ever could. May we say this was not just an ending, but also a place to begin.
I play this video that was created almost a year ago, not to move us backwards into the pandemic, but to help us come into the present with honesty, that we might ever move forward. The week before last, I met up with a colleague who came to see me at the Chapel of St. Matthew. As he walked up the sidewalk, I saw him reach into his pocket and get his face mask. I rose from my desk chair to greet him at the door, grabbing my own polka dot face mask, and we had them on by the time we stepped into that common space on the lower level. But then we had that conversation that's becoming more and more common. I'm fully vaccinated. I'm okay without, are you? And he said that he was. And so we took off our masks and we saw each other's faces in person inside, not through a screen, for the first time in over a year. And we smiled. Keeping in mind, this was just a colleague of mine, but both of our eyes went a little bit misty. And we just said, well, hi. And yet we still sat a good 8 feet apart for the duration of that meeting. What is the significance of taking off the mask? Is it just exposing the bottom half of your face? Not having to worry about maskne or your glasses constantly fogging up or having to repeat yourself constantly through the muffle, right? Is it just that? Or does it symbolize more? Like reconnecting with others in a way that we are wired to do so as a species. Or also the daily need to reevaluate our understanding of risk and danger yet again, and maybe with fewer emotional reserves than we had 15 months ago. We're in a liminal space right now. A not yet post-COVID world, definitely not pre-pandemic. And many people I listen to are filled with both a yearning and an exhilaration, along with a dread and even panic. One author I read asked, can we just push on pause and go back to the way things were, as if getting a vaccine erases your memory? Another wonders, how will we human again after a year of isolation? I wonder, have you found yourself pondering, is it possible to go back to normal? Or what was that normal? And what should it be? Jim Collins, who's a business author and speaker, said in an interview recently, he said, there will be no new normal. Only a continuous series of not normal episodes, defying prediction and unforeseen by most of us until they happen. Already 1 year ago in June, author and activist Sonia Renee Taylor said this, we will not go back to normal. Normal never was. Our pre-corona existence was not normal, other than we normalized greed, inequity, exhaustion, depletion, extraction, disconnection, confusion, rage, hoarding, hate, and lack. We should not long to return, my friends. And so as we pivot from pandemic, or as we live in this liminal space, perhaps now is a time to take stock. And for the sake of moving forward, first name what we've moved through. For what you cannot name, you cannot process fully. And what you do not feel, you cannot heal. So in these next few months together, we're going to name some things. Anxiety and uncertainty, disappointment, unmet expectations, anger and injustice. But we'll get this party started with grief. Said no one ever, except I just did. Grief. Some of you might know it intimately and acutely right now. Others might say, well, I haven't lost anyone this year, so I'm doing okay. I would argue that grief, even if you live by yourself with no family in a one-room cabin halfway up to Copper Harbor, I would argue that collective grief is in the air. There have been nearly 600,000 extra deaths in our country alone, along with those who would normally have died from heart disease or cancer or old age or accident. That's on par with the entire population of the city of Milwaukee. If you read those names aloud one by one as at a vigil or an All Saints remembrance, that name reading would take 541 hours or 22 days. And if you take this number times the average of close relatives, which is around 9, that's over 5 million people directly mourning the loss of life. And that doesn't count their colleagues, their college roommates, their neighbors, their faith communities, and friends. Then there's the long haulers, living now with disability, others who have been hospitalized who will develop PTSD, our medical professionals who have borne witness to it all, trying to plug a hole in the dam with their bare hands and sometimes their lives. Grief. Grief, as defined by those who study it, grief happens at the death of something. A loved one, yes, but also at the death of things like marriage, that's a divorce, or a relationship, that would be a breakup, or job loss, your work identity, the loss of capability as in physical or mental capacities, or a way of life. Suffering was a part of life before grief we have always shared. I came across a parable. It comes from a book, Buddhism, being a sketch in the life of the teachings of Gautama the Buddha. And this is the parable of the mustard seed. It goes like this. Kisagatami is the name of a young girl whose marriage with the only son of a wealthy man was brought about in a true fairy tale fashion. She had one child. But when the beautiful boy could run alone, it died. The young girl, in her love for it, carried the dead child clasped to her bosom and went from house to house of her pitying friends, asking them to give her medicine for it. But a Buddhist mendicant, thinking she does not understand, said to her, "My good girl, I myself have no such medicine as you ask for, but I think I know of one who has." "Oh, tell me who this is," said Kisagatami. "The Buddha can give you medicine. Go to him," was the answer. And so she went to Gautama, and doing homage to him, she said, "Lord and Master, do you know any medicine that will be good for my child?" "Yes, I know of some," said the teacher. Now, it was the custom for patients or their friends to provide the herbs which the doctors required, so she asked what herbs he would want. "I want some mustard seed," he said. And when the poor girl eagerly promised to bring some of so common a drug, he added, "But you must get it from some house where no son or husband or parent or servant has died." "Very good," she said, and went to ask for it, still carrying her child with her. And the people said, "Here is mustard seed, take it." But when she asked, "In my friend's house, has any son died, or a husband, or a parent, or a servant?" they answered, "Lady, what is it that you say? The living are few, but the dead are many." Then she went to other houses, but one said, "I have lost a son," another, "We have lost our parents," another, "I have lost my servant." At last, not being able to find a single house where no one had died, her mind began to clear. And summoning up resolution, she left the body of her child in the forest, and returning to the Buddha, paid him homage. He said to her, "Have you the mustard seed?" "My lord," she replied, "I have not. The people tell me that the living are few, but the dead are many." Then he talked to her on that essential part of the system, the impermanence of all things, till her doubts were cleared away, and accepting her lot, she became a disciple and entered the first path. Suffering is. That's the first noble truth of our Buddhist brothers and sisters. Suffering is. Grief is. This year, some of us have lost loved ones. Some of us have lost health or mobility. We all have experienced a collective loss of the world we lived in before the pandemic. Do you remember what airports were like before 9/11? We're going to already start talking about, do you remember life before COVID? When we didn't hesitate to shake someone's hand, when we spent time in crowded arenas or county fairs or high school gyms unmasked, when we never considered having something like a vaccination passport, when we didn't give singing in community a second thought. There has been collective loss, and like most losses, we didn't know what we had until it was gone. C.S. Lewis wrote 2 books on grief. The Problem of Pain was published in 1940, and it takes on the question of theodicy. Theodicy, or the problem of suffering, in its classical form goes like this. If the divine is all-knowing, all-powerful, all-just, why do people suffer? Why do bad things happen to good people? C.S. Lewis, who has this masterful, rational, and tight philosophical argument having to do with free will and the like. But then in 1960, he publishes, at first under a pseudonym, another book called A Grief Observed. And this was a collection of writings from his journals in the aftermath of his wife's death, who died just 3 years after they were married of cancer. And as you might guess, in this writings, he's not so philosophical or rational. He moves in and out of the stages of grief, railing at God like the psalmist of old. And in this volume, he says, nobody told me that grief felt so much like fear. Nobody told me that grief felt so much like fear. Because when the world or your world suddenly changes, nothing feels stable. Some who I have counseled and in my own life, I know that grief comes in waves. At first, the waves hit you frequently and forcefully so that you can hardly stand, you can hardly function. Eventually, as time passes, the waves don't come as often, but when they're triggered, they can still knock you off your feet. They're still painful, the loss. Most of us are familiar with those 5 stages of grief that were brought up by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. You might be able to name them to yourself or with someone in your room with you right now. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. And yet Kubler-Ross and her understudy and co-worker David Kessler, they were adamant to tell us that these stages were never a way to try to make grief neat and tidy. They were never prescriptive, but only meant to be descriptive. These 5 stages are like a scaffolding, a loose structure that describe common but not linear or inevitable occurrences in those who grieve. As we've come to around month 15 of this pandemic, I wonder if many of us, A, have never named aloud the grief at the multi-leveled losses we've experienced, or B, if we have named it, maybe we thought we should be getting over it by now, like we should be at stage 5, acceptance, or Kessler's stage 6, which is meaning making. It's summer after all, so many are vaccinated. Come on. I love my parents, but I wonder if in their 2 personalities they embody how we are taught to go at our emotions in this country, especially those emotions we perceive as negative. My dad, Dwayne, is the stoic. Don't feel it, stuff it down, suck it up, get on with it. What, you have a high ankle sprain? Get back in the game, tape it up, you're fine. Stoic, Sisu. My mom, she's all empathy, all love and care, but then, oh, look at the rainbow. Oh, the puppy, the blue sky, move on. Smile, though your heart is aching. Smile, even though it's breaking, as that song goes, right? And I got to wondering if maybe Americans collectively, I'm not a sociologist, I just dabble at it. Maybe Americans suffer from this unhealthy marriage of stoicism and sometimes toxic positivity. Stoicism plus toxic positivity, all of it leading many of us to want to move through or ignore unpleasant emotions and do so quickly and focus on what comes next, onward, upward, carpe diem, and all of that, right? And yet, as I've been learning through my studies and counseling and meditation and Buddhism, emotions are neither good nor bad. They just are. Our emotions, our experiences are signposts, telling us something, information, if only we are curious enough to stop judging ourselves and others for having them and explore. And as emotions researcher Dr. Mark Brackett has pointed out, unfelt emotions or denied emotions are not benign. They metastasize. And the debt is going to be called up, whether it's in our physical health, our mental health, our relationships, and our capacity for connection and joy and vulnerability. Maybe you don't think you've had it as bad as others this year, and so you maybe deny or play down your feelings. And that's not a bad thing, right? Perspective taking. But the game of whose loss is the worst or who deserves to grieve, that is always a trap. Like when at the beginning of the pandemic, people were rolling their eyes at our high schoolers, I might have been among them, I admit, for being crushed at not having a graduation ceremony or a prom. That's nothing, they might say. Try fighting a war or getting a hysterectomy. And yet, comparative suffering is never a win for anyone. The worst loss is always your own. The worst loss is always your own. Pain is pain, grief is grief, and grief must be named. It must be witnessed by ourselves and by others. The book of Job is probably the most famous example of the question of suffering in the Hebrew scriptures. So the story goes, Job loses his family, his livelihood, and even his health. And at one point we find him sitting in sackcloth on a pile of ashes with a shaved head and sores covering his body. The definition and image of despair. And Job's friends, one by one, come to him in his grief. And they start out with just the right instinct. They come and they sit with him for a whole week. They just sit and not saying anything. They sit with their friend in the discomfort of despair. But then they try to figure it out, asking questions like, what did you do to make this fall upon you, Job? Or, are you sure you didn't pray poorly to God or cheat someone in business? Or they're trying to justify his pain. They're trying to give it purpose, probably make sense of it for their own selves, but in doing so, they're making it worse. And when Job adamantly refuses to concede that he brought any of this or deserved any of this, his companions go on a lecture train, multiple chapters, and become probably the most terrible friends in biblical and maybe historical record. Grief must be named, witnessed, experienced, but never quickly moved through, justified, or fixed. After the loss of a child, statistics show that divorce rates go up significantly among families. The death of a child is one of, if not the most stressful thing a family system can ever endure. But then those who study grief have found it's not the loss of the child itself that breaks up the marriage. It's not the loss of the child that breaks up the couple. Rather, it is more often the judgment of the other's grief. Hear that again. It's not the loss of the child, but the judgment of the other's grief. The judgment of other people's grief wreaks havoc on relationship, and it's not just between spouses. We make up stories when our family members are not grieving a mutual loved one in the same way or the same stage as we are. Well, I guess Mary didn't love Dad the way I did. Just think how this could apply to how we judge or don't judge people as they move through this pandemic and the grief we all share. We are so judgmental towards each other, and judgment always demands punishment. Judgment always demands punishment. It either hurts us or it hurts others. Theologically and philosophically, the concept that everything happens for a reason is fatalistic and fraught. Some things just suck. Like the sucker punch that is acute grief at a loved one, like the cloud that is collective grief and trauma brought on by this pandemic. So what are we to do? In that first parable I read about the mustard seed, we heard it, that you are not alone. Suffering is. Everything is impermanent. Can we accept that? And then be gracious to one another. Assume that others are doing the best that they can just to keep it all together. I wonder if empathy is the act of letting our hearts break for those whose hearts are breaking. Because at some point we have known or will know that same pain. If we are not in acute loss, we have been or will be. If we are vaccinated and moving on, India is not. Our children aren't there yet. I wonder, no matter where you are in your grief of this past year, how can you remain present with the collective pain and your pain among us? Resist armoring up or sucking it up. Keep a strong back, yes, but a soft front that leaves you open for empathy and connection, for doing what you can to bless others. Suffering is. Suffering with is grace in action. I heard recently a parable, maybe you've heard it, of a person who had died and was ushered into the afterlife. And he is led into a room, and there is a banquet table laid with the most splendid of foods. There's the aroma of fresh bread and dishes just simmering with butter. It was lit by candlelight. There were flowers on the table. And yet those in attendance at the table were unexpected. They were gaunt and starving. Because you see, the spoons, the only utensil provided were these spoons at the table that were so long that you could not, once you scooped up the food, you could not reach it into your own mouth. The person showing them this scene said, this is hell. But then that same person was led to a second room, and the second room, there was the same splendid blanket, the same scrumptious smells, the same candlelight and music, and the same spoons, those long, long spoons. But here the people were laughing and well-fed and merry because they knew that the only way to find substance was to feed each other with those spoons. And that was heaven. Even when we are in the midst of it, whether it's grief or sadness, life is to be found when we bear witness to one another's grief, to their pain, to show up for one another where we can, to show up for what we can. And in doing so, we then dine at the feast of human love, and we can still experience this abundance that defies even a global pandemic. Next time when we are together, we'll explore what happens when you want to show up and reconnect with friends in your community, to be there with them once more, but then anxiety gets in the way. What happens when this grief and trauma you've been through this last year has sucker punched you into yourself, and like a turtle, you're scared to stick your head out. So next time we'll seek wisdom and we'll breathe through that experience. For now, may your souls be comforted, that you might comfort others. May you find grace with yourself and grace with others this week, that you might live life abundant, day by day.